Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of The Life of the Emperor Francis Joseph by Francis Gribble. Chapter 7.
It is a curious fact that Francis Joseph, who was to find the hangman so much work to do, was given at his birth the nickname of the Child of the Gallows. The story is that his mother, in the later days of her confinement, threw the scalding contents of a coffee cup in her husband's face and declared that she could be safely delivered of a child on one condition only, that a free pardon were granted to some criminal lying under sentence of death. And there was nothing for it but to satisfy her whim. The only Austrian subject fulfilling the conditions was clearly guilty of the blackest crimes. But he was let out of prison, to his amazement, at the hysterical request of the Archduchess Sophia, whose bowels of compassion then closed, never to be reopened. Assuredly, neither she nor anyone else prompted her son to compassion when Italy and Hungary lay helpless at his feet. The clemency accorded to a vulgar criminal was not to be extended to political offenders until the heads of all the tallest poppies had been cut off for the greater glory of the Habsburgs and their bureaucrats, and the policy of repression enjoyed an illusory success. If the strong hand was a bloody hand, the bloody hand was a strong hand, and Austria did not muddle through her difficulties, but carved her way through them. She had nothing as yet to fear from Prussia. She strode with jackboots through Hungary and northern Italy, and the House of Habsburg, bankrupt but with the most effective army in Europe, could once more afford to be arrogant. So that we find Francis Joseph, as soon as his position was secure, manifesting his family pride by a proposal that Napoleon III should be insulted. Napoleon, the triumph of his coup d'état having been confirmed by a plebiscite, had written to his royal and imperial cousins to announce his accession, and the question arose whether he should be welcomed as a member of the family or snubbed as a parvenu intruding in exclusive circles. Should he be saluted, according to the time-honored formula, as Sir and Brother, or should he be rebuffed by a cold and contemptuous mode of address? Francis Joseph and his advisers favored the latter course. The emperor, that is to say, who had waded to his throne through the blood and slaughter of his subjects, despised the emperor whose subjects had merely elected him, and proposed to keep him in his place by addressing him curtly as Sir. It was to have been a concerted insult, simultaneously administered by the heads of the houses of Habsburg, Hohenzollern, and Romanov, and the foreign ministers of the three countries exchanged dispatches on the subject. In the end, however, only the Romanov showed the courage of his arrogance, and the Habsburg, after going far enough to offend, allowed himself to be intimidated into an appearance of courtesy. But Napoleon was not conciliated. He bided his time, resolved that the cousin who had devised the affront should pay for it. We shall see him presently exacting payment on the fields of Magenta and Solferino, but we must first follow Francis Joseph as he enters upon the path of reconstruction at home. It was the period in which his personality began to count. He introduced what is called the Bach system, Bach being Schwarzenberg's successor in the Ministry of the Interior, a bureaucrat who wanted to Germanize everybody and everything, as German bureaucrats always do, a process which pleased the Czechs and Croats as little as the Hungarians. "This is good," chuckled a Hungarian in conversation with a Croat. "The Austrians give to you as a reward what they give to us as a punishment." That, clearly, was a frame of mind symptomatic of trouble to come. But two things staved off the trouble for the moment. Austria was strong, and Francis Joseph was affable, and could give the impression that his bonhomie was his own, and that his severities were his ministers. He traveled about his dominions, making himself as pleasant as he could. He released 2,000 political prisoners and reduced the sentences of others. The mere possibility of such a magnanimous act shows how terribly cruel the previous repression had been, but the clemency produced a certain effect. No doubt Francis Joseph's reception in Hungary was, to some extent, stage-managed, but it was at least possible to pretend that it had been enthusiastic. The fact that he sat his horse like a centaur and spoke Hungarian like a native produced its effect, and he knew what to ignore and how to turn a compliment. "I have met many Hungarians," he said on his return from his first journey, "and every one of them was a man of heart. It was what the French call le mot de la situation, and it helped. Another thing which helped was the attempt made on his life at about this time by the journeyman tailor Le Benny, who tried to stab him in the back of the neck while he was walking on the Vienna ramparts, but struck a bone at the base of the skull, which turned the edge of the blade. He bore himself gallantly on the occasion, making light of the wound. "Do not be frightened, dear mother. My neck is merely a little stiff," he said to the Archduchess Sophia. "It is no great matter," he said to his officers. "After all, I was in no greater peril than my brave soldiers in Italy." These, again, were mots de la situation, appealing to the imagination. The Hungarians had a chivalry of their own which bade them repudiate the dagger as a weapon. Bathiani's widow and Caroli's mother, she who had uttered the curse, would no doubt have been equally ready to pray God to smite the emperor and to thank God for sparing him in order that he might suffer. But the empire as a whole, not the Austrian section of it only, saw him as a gallant young man who had had a fortunate escape. Deputations came from the remotest parts of his dominions to congratulate him. He was making a good impression, too, on shrewd observers. Bismarck, then a young man, being sent on some mission to him, spoke of the fire of his 20 years joined to the dignity and thoughtfulness of a riper age, adding, "Were he not an emperor, he would seem to me almost too grave for his years." The King of the Belgians, a little later, reported very favorably of him to Queen Victoria. "The young emperor," he wrote, "I confess I like very much. There is much sense and courage in his warm blue eye, and it is not without a very amiable merriment when there is occasion for it. He is slight and very graceful, but even in the melee of dancers and archdukes, he may always be distinguished as the chef. He keeps everyone in great order, without requiring for this an outre appearance, merely because he is the master, and there is that about him which gives authority, and which sometimes those who have the authority cannot succeed in getting accepted or in practicing. I think he may be severe, si l'occasion se présente. He has something very muthig. We were several times surrounded by people of all classes, and he's certainly quite at their mercy, but I never saw his little muthig expression changed either by being pleased or alarmed." Unquote. Lady Westmoreland also wrote at about the same time to Mr. Hood, "I am very much pleased with the young emperor, and especially with his tender affection for his mother, and his tender and respectful manner to her. He looks even younger than he is, and is not handsome, but has a well-built, active figure and a most intelligent and expressive face. He has a thoughtful face, and is perfectly unaffected. His mother is a very interesting person, and is wrapped up in this son, who seems likely to justify the pride she takes in him. The father is a very poor creature, who cares for nothing but having his leisure unmolested." Unquote. The picture, save for the reference to the inadequate Archduke Francis Charles, is a pleasant one. The portrait of Francis Joseph is the portrait of a man whose personality was already a great asset to his country. Not at all the portrait of a man who was conscious of having been cursed by the woman whose son he had slain, and feared that the blows of fate would smite him, blow after blow from youth to age, in untiring fulfillment of that curse. On the contrary, it is the portrait of a fairly strong man, who is also a decidedly cheerful man, with a mind conscious of rectitude, and no doubt it is accurate as far as it goes, for one cannot expect portraits to be prophetic. But the years were nevertheless to be full of trouble. Political trouble was soon to strip the Habsburgs of treasured territorial possessions, while family troubles were to make their name a byword as that of the most tragic house in Europe. The political troubles were to begin with the bungling of Austrian policy in connection with the Crimean War, when Austria tried to run with the hare and hunt with the hounds, and gave offense to both. The Tsar, having saved Francis Joseph's throne in 1849, now thought himself entitled to more gratitude than was shown to him. "The two stupidest kings of Poland," he said to Valentine Esterhazy, "were John Sobieski and myself, for both of them had helped Austria in her hour of need, and been deserted by Austria when they were themselves embarrassed. Austro-Russian enmity in the Near East dates from that desertion. But the desertion was not complete enough to gain Austria the compensating friendship of France. So that presently, in 1859, France would help Sardinia to deprive Austria of the province of Lombardy, and Russia would stand by, chuckling at her discomfiture. But that, again, is an anticipation. For the moment, indeed, all seemed well. Neither the political troubles nor the family troubles were as yet in sight, and it must have appeared to any who gave a thought to the matter that the Countess Caroli had pronounced her curse in vain. Francis Joseph was the most eligible party in Europe, and the time having come for him to seek a wife, he was not to have his marriage arranged for him by statesmen to suit their policy, but to fall in love, almost as princes do in fairy tales, in very romantic circumstances, though the romance, unlike so many of the Habsburg romances, was to be consonant with Habsburg dignity and self-respect. It was not, of course, a Cophetua story. The Habsburgs are very fond of imitating King Cophetua, but they do so to their disgrace and at their peril. Their names, unless good reason to the contrary can be shown, are changed. They cease to be archdukes, become mere Orths or Wolflings or Bergs, and are bowed or kicked, as the case may be, out of the imperial circle. But a Cinderella story, that is another matter. And the story of Francis Joseph's marriage is one of the most famous Cinderella stories of modern times. Every fresh narrator of it adds some fresh detail, whether romantic or picturesque, but the essential facts in all the versions of the story are the same. It is always a story of a match arranged by a matchmaking mother, and of Prince Charming himself taking the matter into his hands at the 11th hour, preferring Cinderella to her sisters, insisting upon his own way, and getting it amid loud popular acclamations. The Archduchess Sophia flattered herself that she had settled everything over her son's head. She wished to do a good turn to her poor relations, the Wittelsbachs, dukes in Bavaria, and cousins of the reigning Bavarian house to which she herself belonged. There was a strain of insanity in the House of Bavaria, in both branches of it, in fact, as well as in the House of Habsburg. But the Archduchess Sophia did not think of that. The Eugenists had not yet spoken, and she might not have listened to them if they had. Insanity in those days was regarded, especially in royal circles, as the accidental misfortune of the individual. Tendencies to insanity did not count, and any royal personage who was not mad enough to be locked up was thought sane enough to be married. Moreover, the Bavarian insanity was not, at the moment, very pronounced. Ludwig I was not accounted mad because of his subjection to Lola Montez, and the vagaries of Ludwig II and the raving mania of Otto still belonged to the future. It seemed to the Archduchess Sophia as right and reasonable as anything could be that the House of Bavaria and the House of Habsburg should intermarry yet again. She talked the matter over with her cousin, Maximilian, Duke in Bavaria. He had a daughter, Princess Helen, of a suitable age, a very beautiful and charming girl, and it was settled between them that Princess Helen should become Empress of Austria. She was trained for that position as carefully as Francis Joseph was trained for the position of emperor. And Francis Joseph quite approved of the plans which were being made for him, quite understood that his dignity limited his choice, quite believed that all was being contrived for the best by the best of all possible matrimonial agents. It was arranged that Princess Helen should be brought to Ischl to meet him. The subsequent announcement of his betrothal to her was, as it were, on the order of the day. He went to Ischl and met Princess Helen. She was very charming, but still more charming, as it seemed to Francis Joseph, was her younger sister, Princess Elisabeth, the Cinderella who was kept in the background. Elizabeth had not been trained for any great position. She was only 16, a madcap and a child of nature, accustomed, in so far as anyone in her station might be, to the untrammeled freedom of a Highlander. She roamed the woods and the mountains, though not, as the author of The Martyrdom of an Empress tells us, with a gun in her hand, in pursuit of game. There are stories of her playing the zither at the doors of cottages in remote Bavarian valleys, while peasant children danced to the music, and she was strangely beautiful, with haunting eyes and a wonderful wealth of hair. Depths of meaning looked out of those eyes, indications of those mysteries of her soul through which she was presently to figure as an unfathomable conundrum challenging a curious world. Francis Joseph, tall, handsome, blonde, blue-eyed, a proud soldier and a gallant man, with no mystery or semblance of a mystery about him, looked into the girl's eyes and was conquered. Elizabeth was not formally presented. It was almost by accident that Francis Joseph first saw her. He was alone in a room when she entered, in a simple white dress, with flowers in her hair, and greeted him with a "Good morning, cousin." He kept her talking, and of course, as he was the emperor, she could not possibly run away and leave him, however shy she felt, for quite a long time, and he ended by saying that he hoped to resume the conversation at dinner, or at the dance which was to follow. But Elizabeth feared not. She was still in the schoolroom, not yet out, had nothing to wear. "Still, if your majesty insists," she hesitated. "I do insist," said Francis Joseph. "Listen, we'll play a comedy. Say nothing to anyone, but dress for the party and come down to it." "But I shall be scolded." "No, you won't. I'll see to that. You can trust me." So the comedy was played. And of course, when the emperor expressed his pleasure at seeing the unexpected guest, the scolding flickered out. And after that, matters progressed at a great pace, to the great chagrin, as one cannot doubt, of Sister Helen. The emperor outraged all the proprieties by dancing half the night with the schoolgirl. When the dance was interrupted for tea to be served, he showed her an album containing colored illustrations of the various national costumes worn in the 18 states of Austria. "There," he said, "these are my subjects. I wonder if you would like them to be your subjects too." Then they danced again, and when the cotillon came, he presented his little Cinderella with a bouquet of edelweiss, gathered with his own hands, with the result that everyone except Cinderella herself began to suspect that his intentions were serious. His Cinderella, indeed, could hardly believe that his intentions were serious, even when her mother told her so. "What? Me an empress? But I am nobody!" she exclaimed skeptically. But she had not long to wait before the sense of her importance was brought home to her, for at 10 o'clock the next morning, Francis Joseph's carriage rattled up to the door of her hotel. "Is the Princess Elisabeth up?" he asked, and the reply was that Princess Elisabeth had not finished dressing. "Then I will see the Duchess," he said, and he went up and made his formal demand for his Cinderella's hand, with the result that, half an hour later, all the members of the Imperial family then in Ischl were summoned to the little parish church, and there, to the strains of the Austrian national anthem, the betrothal was solemnly celebrated. His words to his affianced bride as he came out of the church are said to have been, "This is the happiest day of my life. I owe my happiness to you, and I thank you for the light which you have brought into my life." It was very sad, of course, for Sister Helen, who afterwards sought consolation, but perhaps failed to find it, by marrying the Prince of Thurn and Taxis. It was not altogether satisfactory to Duke Maximilian, who raised such objections as Laban raised when Jacob proposed to marry Rachel and leave Leah a spinster. It did not altogether please the Archduchess Sophia, who was a masterful woman and would rather have got her own way than see her son insist successfully upon his. But it was a love match, and that, after all, is the main thing in royal as in other marriages. There was no need for the court and society journalists to rack their brains for reasons for describing the union as romantic. It was romantic on the face of it, as romantic as anything in any fairy tale. And yet, as it proved, things were not exactly what they seemed to be, and that marriage, so romantically contrived and concluded, was to be the starting point of tragedies. The beginning, if one is superstitious and takes that view of things, of the fulfillment of Countess Caroli's curse.
Chapter 8.
The failure of a marriage, of a royal marriage as of any other, is necessarily wrapped in mystery. The full facts are never made known, and one always feels that the facts kept secret were probably more important than the facts disclosed. Moreover, personality, that mysterious thing which none of us ever reveals completely to any one observer, inevitably counts for more than the tangible events on which we can lay our fingers. So with this marriage of Francis Joseph's. The outcome of it, what the world has been allowed to see of its outcome, can only be understood, in so far as it is intelligible at all, if we examine it in the light of a personality which perplexed Europe for a generation, perplexing it more and more as years went on. Not two personalities, be it observed, but one. There are some personalities which fail to create an atmosphere of mystery even behind an impenetrable screen. And Francis Joseph's personality is of that type. One always feels that, beyond what one knows of him, there is very little to be known. It is characteristic of all the Habsburgs that they cannot cross the road without striking an attitude which shows us exactly where they stand and what they think of things. And it is easy enough to accept the present emperor as typical of the Habsburgs at their best. He comes before us, frank and brave, adaptable and affable, but, at the same time, proud as Lucifer, infinitely gracious to those who do not presume, readily regarded by such as a gallant soldier who has grown into a genial old gentleman, anxious to make things pleasant for everybody, yet seeming, at some crises of his fate, to mistake himself for God and the archdukes for the archangels, not because they behave as such, but because they are Habsburgs and ought to. That is a perfectly simple type. One does not complicate it when one adds that Francis Joseph has always been a punctual observer of Roman Catholic ritual, and taking the métier of emperor seriously, has risen early throughout a long life in order to work at it with all the diligence of a devoted civil servant. All that, down to and including the occasional ceremonial washing of the feet of the poor, in imitation of his Master Christ, has been the straightforward fulfillment of an intelligible program. If Francis Joseph had washed the feet of the poor because he had felt that they needed washing and would not otherwise get washed, the case would have been different, and one would have suspected subtlety in his character. But he has only washed them gingerly, after servants had seen to it that they were already clean, in the manner of an actor aiming at spectacular display, and one no more finds anything subtle or elusive in that piece of symbolism than in anything else that he has done. About the Empress, on the other hand, it is impossible to read a page from any pen, whether that page be written by an intimate or by a stranger, without feeling oneself in the presence of a mystery which the most favorably placed chroniclers have failed to penetrate. A novelist of genius might perhaps have invented her. Mr. Maurice Barrès, for one, is a little prone to write as if he had invented her, but she was not to be understood by courtiers, secretaries, and ladies-in-waiting. They recite her traits at great length, but almost in vain, telling us of her kindnesses, her eccentricities, her vanities, but still leaving us at sea, puzzled by the melancholy which preceded the apparent occasions for melancholy, and by the restlessness which chased her like a gadfly from the haunts of men, unless it was that she herself pursued. She knew not exactly what, and never found it. Countess Marie Larache seems to have been more in her confidence than anyone else, but Countess Marie Larache only saw what she was capable of seeing, which assuredly was not all. One may admit all Countess Marie Larache's facts, and yet doubt the completeness of her portrait. And if Elizabeth's confidant, insofar as she had one, did not understand, how was her husband, a mere man, a mere soldier, a mere Habsburg, to do so? He, being, as the French say, tout en dehors, could not possibly comprehend her who was tout en dedans. His happiness in marriage, as long as he actually was happy in it, must have depended on the assumption that his wife was as simple and translucent as himself, as simple and translucent as Cinderella or the Sleeping Beauty. He fell in love with her in that belief, as any other gallant young soldier might have done, and there is no doubt whatever that he was very passionately in love. As much in love as any lieutenant in my army, was his own way of putting it, and when his bride came down the Danube to join him, he ran to greet her on her boat before the gangway was made secure, and very nearly fell into the water. That, as he did not actually slip in, was an auspicious beginning, and it is on record that Emperor and Empress and everybody else said and sincerely meant the right and proper and auspicious things. The bride, said the Austrian people, and the Hungarian people too, is the most beautiful woman in all Christendom. I am glad, Elizabeth wrote in the veteran Radetzky's album, that I am about to belong to a country which possesses an emperor who is so great and good and a hero of Radetzky's valor. Never before, said Francis Joseph to O'Donnell, the officer who had grappled with the tailor Lebegny on the day of the attempted assassination, did I feel so grateful to you for saving my life. For never before did I value my life so much. and he showed his joy by pardoning prisoners and giving 200,000 florins to the poor, while the sympathies of the whole people followed the young couple when they departed on their honeymoon and gathered Edelweiss together, like any other honeymooning couple. The recollection of that April day, wrote a witness of the scene, will never be effaced from my mind. The old among us felt themselves young again. The sorrowful became glad, the sick forgot their pains, and the poor their poverty. All alike were eager to see the companion whom the emperor had chosen as the partner of his life. God only knows how many tears of joy ran down our cheeks, and what ardent prayers were uttered by our lips. It is easy to say, in the light of subsequent events, that the joy was too bright to last, and that the hope arose only to be overcast. But it is difficult, setting superstition aside, to say why it was so, though it is not impossible to trace some of the steps by which it came to be so. In this exalted household, two factors which are often seen at work in humbler households were presently, though not quite immediately, to play their part: a mother-in-law and an Egeria. The pity was the greater because, from the point of view of politics and the dynasty, the emperor's beautiful bride promised to be, and indeed was, an asset of great value. The popularity for which he had to work hard, she achieved without an effort by the indefinable charm of her youth and loveliness, especially among the romantic and chivalrous Hungarians who had not yet forgiven Francis Joseph for the severities of 1849. She had Hungarian blood in her veins, though her Hungarian ancestors were remote, and she had no responsibility for the atrocities of the repression. On the contrary, she made it clear to Hungarians that she sympathized with their sufferings and delighted in their country, its vast spaces and its heroic patriots, indomitable even though conquered. Amnesties, as we have seen, attended her arrival among them. Amnesties which she may or may not have inspired, but of which she certainly got all the credit. Whatever she was or was not, she was, at any rate, tender-hearted and impulsive with the impulsiveness of a generous girl who feels instinctively that all the people who are locked up ought to be let out and given a second chance, unless they are really dangerous criminals. The Hungarians, in consequence, fell in love with her to a man, with a passion different from, but more enduring than, her husband's, and one of them, Count Alexander von Bertha, wrote of her marriage: "It was the installation on the throne, under the aegis of beauty and charm, of the guardian angel of the Magyars, to whom the young empress felt herself specially attracted by the memory of her patron saint who belonged to the house of Arpad." The allusion is, of course, to the empress's namesake, Saint Elizabeth of Hungary, and the sentiment stirred by the association bore practical political fruit. It is no depreciation of the work done in later years by Deák and Buste to say that their task would have been vastly more difficult if Elizabeth had not charmed the spirits of the Hungarians, and that it was largely owing to the spell which she had thrown upon them that Deák was able to announce, when asked to name his terms after the disasters of 1866, that Hungary demanded no more after Sadowa than she had asked before. That was a great achievement, not to be made the less of because it was due to no conscious statesmanship, but merely came about through the idealization of a beautiful and sympathetic woman by a childlike and romantic race, too long accustomed to be treated as pariahs by the domineering Teutons. If the laws of romance had governed the business of the world, it would have set the seal on the happiness of a marriage which had begun so happily. But it seems that, as a matter of fact, the happiness had taken wings and fled long before Elizabeth's charm had conciliated her husband's enemies to this good purpose, long, also, before the occurrence of those specially tragic events which were to make their reign memorable for tragedy. At first, no doubt, she showed a naive delight at her sudden elevation to imperial dignity. The dramatic change in her fortunes appealed to her imagination, and it seemed as if all the glories of the world were hers. But, vanity of vanities, the years passed, a few years only, and Elizabeth had learnt the preacher's lesson. Even then, one suspects, the desires which haunted her were vague. She did not know exactly what it was that she wanted, but she knew only too well that, whatever it was, neither her marriage nor her exalted rank had given it to her. and we soon begin to hear of her long journeys in pursuit of the fugitive shadow and of the mysterious melancholy which had visibly settled on her. She was still a young woman when she said to a confidant, apropos of what one is left to guess, "I feel as if something had died in me." She was not yet 30 when Countess Marie Lariche, a child who had climbed a tree, saw her in tears in circumstances which she has graphically described. "I nearly fell out of the tree when I recognized the Empress, who had apparently given up the idea of riding and was walking quite unattended. Elizabeth came slowly to my tree, under which was a stone seat. She sat down, clasped her hands in a despairing kind of way, and began to cry silently. I could see that she was greatly distressed, for her face wore a hopeless expression, and occasionally a sob shook her. She then wept unrestrainedly, and at last I wondered whether I dared attempt to comfort her. I bent down, and as the leaves rustled with my sudden movement, the Empress looked up and saw me." Unquote. That is perhaps the most typical of all the pictures of her melancholy, though one could take many others from the writings of other chroniclers. She told the child she had been crying because her little daughter had been unwell during the night, but the child did not believe her. She told the child not to tell anyone that she had seen her cry, which she would hardly have troubled to do if her tears had had such a simple source. Some speeches attributed to her at other times would seem to indicate that she cried sometimes for lost illusions, like a child for a broken toy. Quote, "The happiness which men seek in sincerity and ask from it is controlled by tragic laws. We all live on the edge of an abysm of grief and pain, dug for us by the falsehood of social morality. That is the abysm which separates our actual condition from the condition in which we ought to find ourselves. An abysm is always an abysm. The moment we try to cross it, we fall and break our limbs." Unquote. That is her own confession of melancholy, and we must make what we can of it in the light of what we know. It is not perhaps a melancholy of which we shall be able to discover all the causes, but we may be able to arrive at some of them. The quest will bring us back to certain matters already touched upon, and lead us on to other matters. We shall have to speak of the Egeria, the mother-in-law, the formal rigidity of court etiquette, and the way in which emperor and empress endeavored to escape in different directions from what they were both, in their several ways, coming to regard as irksome imprisoning restraints.
This concludes today's reading of the life of the Emperor Francis Joseph, by Francis Gribble. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.